what's the difference between denotation and connotation? Denotation is the literal or primary meaning of a word, whereas connotation is an idea or feeling which a word invokes for a person in addition to its literal or primary meaning. So denotation is really straightforward then, right? It's like the dictionary definition. It's what everybody would understand by the word, isn't it? Or is it? Think about the word house, for example. Wouldn't it have different denotations in different cultures? And the notion of connotation seems simple too at first. If it's all about associative meanings, that means it's all about the individual, right? My connotations will be different from your connotations because of our different life experiences, won't they? But again, it's not as simple as that. Let's hear from Louis Althusser. He's a Marxist theorist. Here he is, looking as if he's delighted to be sharing his knowledge with us all. He says that at the same time as we learn denotations, we learn dominant connotations. Think about the word mother, for example. In a purely denotative sense, it means the female parent of a child. But we could argue that society encourages us to see the denotative meaning of mother as more than that, as the nurturing caregiver, the main carer for her children. Many mothers work and care for children, and many fathers are the main caregiver for the children in the family. But most societies still encourage us to see that as slightly out of the ordinary, and perhaps even not the way it should be in some societies. This is changing all the time, but it's an example of us learning dominant connotations along with denotations. We could say then that there's a continuum between denotation and connotation. That's not the only way in which connotation can be a bit complex. There is variation in which connotations are drawn, even dominant ones to some extent, which can be related to various aspects of your identity. Your culture, gender, ethnicity, social class, age, and so on. These occur because of the contexts in which language is used, or in which images are used. How do you feel emotionally when you see the British flag or the Irish flag? What do you associate with them? Your answer is going to be based to a greater or lesser extent on your experiences, your background, the national identity you choose for yourself, and your political opinions. Your answer is likely going to be different from the answers of some other people in the class. It's definitely going to be different from the answer of someone who has never lived in Northern Ireland, and it is probably going to be a bit different from older relatives of yours who lived during the period of the Troubles. I am one of those older people, and I've known some people who wouldn't wear the colour green or wouldn't wear the colour blue because they associated them so completely with the other side. Which brings us on to changing connotations. The connotations of the flags we've just looked at and the colours we've just talked about are changing and don't cause the more extreme connotations they used to, I don't think, or at least in a much narrower set of contexts. Because the way each generation thinks about something shifts dominant notions about how it is seen. So you guys are changing the connotations of those things we've just talked about. Connotations can also change over time. Consider these three words and phrases: urban, butter, and working mother. Maybe you'd like to pause the video here and note down any ways you can think of that the connotations of these words have changed over time. Way back several centuries ago, when the majority of people lived rurally and many of those people struggled, urban held very positive connotations because a move to the city held the hope of regular work, regular pay, and a more affluent or at least more consistent lifestyle. In due course, though, the experience of and knowledge of the effects of pollution and so on changed the connotations of urban. By the mid-20th century, most people who had the capacity to do so moved out of the urban centres into suburbia or further out again to villages. Fast forward a few decades and industries in the UK closed one by one. With factories and warehouses lying empty, attempts were made to reinvigorate the urban centres and gentrify them. Along came loft living for young professionals, and urban had positive connotations once again. We're still on that positive page, but issues such as the flammable panels on many recently built urban apartment blocks are threatening to shift the connotations of the word and concept to negative once again. Now let's think about butter. Historically, we have a wholesome, natural, idyllic view of butter production, notwithstanding the fact that the lives of those who produced it were in some cases very difficult, as we've considered just a moment ago. So butter has positive connotations at that point. Fast forward to the mid-20th century again, and the margarine trend begins. Margarine is considered to be better for those trying to watch their weight, and butter takes on negative connotations as something fattening. The problem for margarine was, though, that people still loved the taste of butter, so we then had margarine pretending to be butter. At this stage, we had a strange situation where butter still had negative connotations, but buttery flavours had positive connotations. Fast forward again to the present day, and we're embracing all things natural again. We're keen to shop local and know where our food comes from, and once again, butter has relatively positive connotations. Now let's think about the phrase and concept working mother. We've kind of touched on this earlier. The connotations relating to this are quite social class based. In the 20th century, the dominant idea of a mother was a perfect housewife who stayed at home to keep house and care for the children. Some mothers from less affluent backgrounds had to work to have enough money coming into the home, but this was viewed quite negatively or snobbishly. Ironically, at the other end of the scale, we also saw a small number of affluent professional women working also. The current connotations of a working mother are positive in the sense that the dominant idea of a mother is someone who can do it all and who does do it all, who is a sort of superwoman, working professionally and also playing the main caring role for the children. In current times, we have seen quite starkly the tendency for childcare and education in the home falling much more heavily on mothers than on fathers, with exceptions of good practice, of course. All of this relates very closely to dominant norms about gender roles, and in that sense relates to the notion of myth, which we'll explore in one of the other videos this week. So, you can have a situation where connotations are positive, but the experience of the person playing that role is not necessarily as positive. Connotations can also vary relating to one's culture or subculture, or other type of background context. Consider the following words: queer, wicked, and sick. Queer is an example of a community reclaiming a word and shifting its connotations. The word, whose original meaning was strange or peculiar, as you probably know, was used negatively and pejoratively against LGBT people in the past, and the community reclaimed it. We could actually argue that even its denotation has changed, because it is now used by some to represent an identity alternative to or challenging of the dominant norms. The changes in the connotations of queer have been proactive, campaigning, and political. Groups can change the connotations of words much more informally too. That's what happened with wicked and sick at different points in the 20th and 21st centuries, as they were used by young people, taking a word with traditionally negative connotations and shifting it to have positive connotations, and indeed a new denotation. Although this is more informal than the changes to queer, we could still consider it to be pushing against dominant norms. Young people are perhaps reacting against the categories they themselves are placed in by playing with the categories of the language they use. The connotations of some words, and indeed their changing denotations in some cases, can be related to the language they develop from. You may know that the English language contains words that have developed from or been borrowed from a number of different languages. The connotations of these words can be closely related to the connotations of the language itself at the time it was used. Consider these words: home, mansion, and domain. In one sense, they all mean the same thing, the place where a person lives. But house is a neutral term, whereas mansion has come to mean an extremely large and affluent house, and domain is something even bigger. It makes us think of an estate with lots of land, for example. But think about the French you learned at school, and Latin if you learned any. Does mansion look like any French words you know? Maison, right? Which just means house. So what has happened here is that the word for house in French has been borrowed into English and used to mean a better type of house than house. And domain comes from domus in Latin, which again just means house. So what has happened here is that the words borrowed from other languages have taken on denotations that relate to the relative status of those languages. In a slightly different sense, we'll think elsewhere in the module about the connotations of using languages other than the native language of a country for connotative effects in advertising. Think Italian for passion, French for sophistication, and so on. Why not pause the video here and try this in-video task? It's tricky enough to come up with examples off the top of your head, but see how you get on. Make a few notes on your thoughts. These will help you to reinforce your learning you've gained from my explanation and examples. Let's end with a bit of slightly heavier theory. Don't worry if you don't quite get this next bit. On the other hand, some of you might find it quite useful because it's quite visual, and some people find visual learning works for them. Roland Barthes, here he is, talked about denotation and connotation as orders of signification. You can think about this like the progression of climbing steps. Denotation is the first order of signification. If you think of the basic word being on the ground, denotation is like climbing onto the first step, adding in the first layer of meaning to the word. Connotation is the second order of signification. It's like climbing onto the second step. Connotation uses the meaning from the first step, the denotation, and builds up from it into the second layer of meaning, the connotation.